working. Cool. Present. So today we're going to talk about card advantage and other interesting things to do with cards and consequences of cards being your medium. These are technically billed as two separate workshops, but they're both the two shortest workshops in the entire series, and they're closely related, so I'm just going to crunch them down into one day, and we should be fine. I don't think I need to go over who I am and what this workshop series is at this point. So let's dive into talking about card advantage. Okay, so what is card advantage? Is anyone familiar with this concept?
More cards in your hand?
Generally implemented as that, but more options in your opponent.
Yeah, right. Card advantage is the idea that the number of different cards you get to play increases your agency over the game, and agency, as should be no surprise to anyone at this point, is really important in game design, and is really important in being able to win a game, right? Agency is vital for being able to win. Usually in card advantage, we're talking very specifically about like counting the number of different cards that you have access to at one point in time, the number of cards in your hand, the number of cards on the field, and using that number just to represent your agency. Right? If I have two creatures in play, two cards in my hand, I have more agency over the game than my opponent, who has 3 cards in hand and nothing in the field. Right? It's that basic principle. We can also kind of talk about this as the idea that cards are a resource, right? That a resource inherently is kind of an abstraction of agency. And so if we start talking about cards as a method of agency, now we have another lens to viewing cards as a resource, which we kind of talked about tangentially during our resources workshop. And also just in a lot, if you read like card game, not design theory, but strategy theory, right? It is often said that, the player with the most card advantage is the player who wins, right? In Magic, the quote is, the player who draws the most cards wins the game. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings about the basic principles of card advantage? Yes.
There exists some mechanics, like Hearthstone's Tick for Death when you run out of cards thing, that try to pit too much advantage as a negative thing. Is this uncommon, or are there more strong forms of that? Where card advantage is not directly... Well, I mean, card advantage even in that game is strongly tied to having a lot of options and being able to play optimally. But are there any examples you can think of drawbacks to card advantage?
So even like the idea that, if I draw my entire deck, I lose, that's been around since like Magic. I wouldn't necessarily, yes, the idea objectively is if you get too much card advantage, you lose. That idea doesn't actually tend to manifest that way. Simply because you have so many more cards in your deck than you could reasonably get card advantage for. You don't run into the bottom of the deck because you had too much card advantage. You run into the bottom deck for some extraneous factor. Right.
Perhaps not on decking out, but just card advantage at any one moment. Are there games with like underdog mechanics where, you have more cards than I do, so I have some buff?
I have never seen that.
Never mind.
Not to say that that's a bad idea, or you couldn't do interesting things with that.
Yeah.
I've seen cards that take advantage of the opponent's card advantage, like the one where you trade. If they have a ton of cards, that card that I do a thing and I reveal the top card of my deck, and then for every one of my dudes that have the same type as that card, I get points. It's a keyboard thing.
A fair game.
A fair game. Yeah. And so that one takes advantage. If you have a bunch of cards in your hand and you're like, I've got like 3 mothers and I'm crushing it, well, now you have your card advantage is now becoming disadvantageous for you.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to be rare that that's ever played with. It's almost always strictly a benefit, just because having options is strong.
Yeah.
Also, Keyforge's card advantage is very minutely changed in most situations. You tend to always have except for the cards out on the field, you tend to always have 6 cards in your hand.
Buff a middle.
What?
His deck just archiving as a mechanic.
Yeah.
Having like 20 cards in hand for 3 turns.
Yep. I did accidentally design a game once where card advantage was had a really big inherent drawback because it was using a mechanic that we'll talk about later today, where you doubled your deck as your life total, right? You don't lose life, you just lose cards out of your deck. And the way it implemented that, it made it very punishing to draw out your deck because that's just every time you draw a card, you're basically taking 1 damage, and you didn't have many cards in your deck to begin with. So it is possible, and it's an interesting rubber band, right? An interesting trade-off. But yeah, I can't think of any published games that do that much with that idea. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay. So there's kind of a sliding scale of how much a card advantage matters in a given game. If you play a lot of games, you realize there's some games that where card advantage is the entire game, and some games where card advantage is a footnote in strategic thinking. Games, I mean, the game that I call card advantage the game is Vanguard. And Vanguard really comes down to card advantage. And one of the big things it does here is your card advantage is almost your life total, right? You can only defend yourself by burning card advantage, by discarding cards out of hand. So in a lot of ways, your hand size is your life total. You have to maintain it to stay in the game. If you run out of cards in hand, you basically are sitting duck and dead. It also allows you to play with your relative card advantage. You can burn card advantage to protect yourself, and you can force your opponent to burn card advantage by laying on them with a really heavy assault. Alternatively, you can choose not to protect yourself to maintain card advantage. Right, but because card advantage is given such this central place where burning cards out of your hand is just such a key thing to do, the game really quickly begins to revolve around who has card advantage. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings about the role of card advantage in Vanguard? Cool. So flipping the scale, there are also games that really don't care about card advantage. Usually we're going to see this because these games tend to have a refilling hand mechanic. That's a really good way to, if you want to undermine card advantage or to keep card advantage inherently balanced, right? Refilling players' hands to a set number as opposed to drawing a set number of cards is a very good way to do that. Right? This, I think, first came out in Vampire: The Eternal Struggle. That had a primitive version of this mechanic where as soon as you played any card, you drew a card. Modern games have you wait until a certain point and then draw up to your set hand size, like Ashes or Keyforge. Right, because players kind of have a set amount of card advantage inherently, that's really good at subverting this conception of card advantage really matters. Well, card advantage can only matter so much if I'm guaranteed to have 10 cards with card advantage, right? Yes?
Just a clarification on what you mean by card advantage. Is it a relative measurement between you and your opponent, or is it I have this much agency? Because I would argue games like Keyforge, or probably Ashes would be a better example based on how you wrote that slide. You reset to having the same number of options effectively, but relative to the other person, it's the same number. So you don't have an advantage above them, it's just you both have the same.
Correct. I mean, usually the way you're going to look at card advantage, if you want to look at it mathematically, is just how many cards do I have is my card advantage number, how many cards do you have is your card advantage number. Ultimately, yes, the relative part is what matters.
Yeah, I guess it's just strangely worded.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense, though. That is the definition we're going with, and that makes the most sense.
Card advantage over 0 is basically normally what you're going with, and then you compare your two.
Yeah, it's just number of.
Yeah, you can't say, well, I have 6 card advantage. Well, that could mean if you have 2 card advantage, then I'm doing great, and if you have 12 card advantage, then I'm doing horribly. It does really, the relative number is what actually matters. But you can't talk about it non-relatively if you want to.
Yeah. It feels weird because if you want to name that number that is relative, you could say either relative card advantage or changing card advantage or delta card advantage or something.
Or you could just
it's
call
like,
it card advantage.
I have, in the example you gave before, I have 4 or I have -6. It's like, oh, well. Yeah, but I think people are good enough to compare single numbers.
You also don't usually talk about the number. You usually just talk about the
Concept.
concept.
That makes sense as well.
It's just a concept that you can put a number to if you want to, because it is inherently about atomic cards.
Yeah, but
So-
it's rarely analyzed in terms of single numbers because that's not overly helpful.
Yeah.
Because options inherently aren't unequal.
Yeah.
So some are stronger than others. Just having the access to more unique options might give you your one really big one,
Mhm.
and then that one card might be worth 10 in that given instance.
Well, that's card quality, not card advantage. That's a different
Oh.
concept.
But card advantage
the
gives you
theory of card
access.
advantage does treat all cards as equal.
Okay. Right, I shouldn't muddy that. Yeah.
Now this mechanic can have. So we're all good on the basic idea of how refilling hands kind of undermines card advantage and puts the strategic focus on other parts of your game. The other thing that you can do with this is sometimes this actually does this really weird thing. The specific hand fill mechanic does this really weird thing where it actually rewards you with card advantage for playing more cards. Right? In a traditional like Magic, a big way to earn card advantage is to not play cards and to save your cards. Right? If you play your hand, you're going down in card advantage. Keyforge does actually this because of the way Keyforge drawing cards works. The more cards you play, the more empty spots you have in the hand, and the more cards you're going to draw. Which means that over multiple turns, your total card advantage is going to go up. Right? Which is kind of this weird place where, well, now actually there is a conception of card advantage, but now it's how many cards are you burning and replacing. It's not as important a conception of card advantage because it's not instantaneous, but it is there and it is a consequence of that mechanic, which is interesting to think about and play with. Right? The idea that now all of a sudden playing more cards has an inherent strategic value, even if those cards are played at an opportune time. Questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings about that? Cool. Ways to think and use and card advantage in your game. Just some kind of general questions you might want to ask yourself in how card advantage should and will play in your games as you're designing them. Right? I mean, first and foremost, do you want card advantage to matter in your game? Is this a game that cares about card advantage? Is this some strategic concept you want to lean into, or do you want to, do the Ashes thing and just say, I'd rather you worry about other things. Card advantage is taken care of for you. Go bother yourself with other stuff. You can use card advantage because it is a strategic advantage as a reward for certain kinds of actions, right? Do you want the player who's playing slowly and carefully to build up card advantage as a reward for maybe not doing as much, but ultimately gaining a long-term advantage? Or is your game supposed to be about tons of crazy action-packed stuff happening all the time, so you're going to reward players who are just diving in with card advantage to get players to want to dive in and do stuff?
It's a design decision.
Right, it's a design decision. I mean, these are literally all design and props design decisions. That is what these questions are for. Right? Some games actually use card advantage as a strategic conundrum in the game's core mechanics, right? Like Age of Sigmar Champions, and by extension Light Seekers, because they're kind of sort of the same game, does this mechanic where you don't draw cards automatically. You have to choose to not do things to draw cards. So all of a sudden this game is giving you this strategic conundrum of, would I rather have more cards in my hand or be able to do literally anything?
Doesn't having cards that let you draw more cards also kind of add a sort of strategic conundrum?
Mm-hmm.
Because like when you think about a Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, I guess the most basic example is like Pot of Greed.
But Pot of Greed is not a strategic conundrum. Pot of Greed.
Oh, it literally just
It's
gives you...
strictly
Yeah, that
yes,
is
it's
true,
Pot
that
of
is true.
Greed,
That just
yes.
gives you the...
There is no opportunity cost of Pot of Greed.
Oh, yeah. It's, I guess, a fair Yu-Gi-Oh! Card that lets you draw cards when
There's
you're
an opportunity
example.
cost to not playing Pot of Greed.
Losing. Yeah, not being able to draw...
Yeah.
Not being able to just automatically win by drawing the cards you need.
But yes, right? Having to spend some kind of resource to draw cards because, divination, right? Spend 3 mana, draw 3 cards, or draw 2 cards. That's a strategic conundrum right there. It's burning up a card. It's burning up a spot in my deck, right? It's burning up a spot in my hand until I play it. And it's, I could spend that 3 mana on something else. I could spend that 3 mana on Blade Mentor, or a creature that's actually going to punch board, right? So now I have a strategic conundrum. Do I want to draw 2 cards, or do I want to punch a board?
And then, like, if you've got, like, another card, like, that sand guy, that he costs about 3 mana, and as long as he's out on the field, you draw 1 extra card every turn, and so, like, it's really powerful. You get a ton of card advantage. But compared to the spin 3, draw 2, he's very vulnerable.
And we'll talk about these kinds of strategic conundrum when we get to card design and designing actual individual cards. We can talk about this more later then. And then also, you know, we mentioned that card advantage is kind of a resource. It's a lens on a resource. Do you want to lean into that, right? Do you want to say, actually, card advantage just straight up is a resource, you have to burn it to do things? And lean into that with your design and use cards as a resource and force you to discard cards to get stuff done, and force you to burn card advantage to get stuff done, and reward it as a resource, allow the players to generate and maintain it like any other resource. Like, that is a way you could design the game. Any question? Yes.
As you defined CCGs earlier in this series of talks, pretty much every card game has that as a resource.
Yes.
As long as cards can be played and lost and drawn.
Correct.
As long as they're not static in your hand.
There's a reason that this is one of the strategic concepts that is getting its entire own slideshow.
Yeah. So whether or not you acknowledge it as a resource, it exists and functions as one.
Yes. You just get to choose if you're going to play it up or play it down. Lean into it or...
Like, minimize it to focus on something else.
Yeah. But yes, even like Ashes does have a conception of card advantage. There's very much card advantage in Ashes, and that game does so much to subvert the concept of card advantage compared to any other game. Because the way the card drawing just works in that game is just like, no, you just get 5 cards of card advantage per turn. Have fun. Right?
Is BattleCon like that?
Hmm?
Is BattleCon like that?
BattleCon also, yeah.
I wouldn't be
BattleCon
surprised.
does not really have a conception of card advantage. You're playing 2 cards per turn, you're drawing 2 cards per turn, period, end of story. In theory, there's a conception of card advantage in BattleCon, because if you could knock cards out of your opponent's hand, but the game just does not do that. So that is a very rigorously flat plane of card advantage. Again, it's not that card advantage doesn't exist, it's that the game
It's level at all points.
is actively leveling it. And so that becomes much less of a concern. Any other questions about card advantage at all? Concerns, ideas, conceptions? Cool. So that's card advantage. So now we're going to talk about other things to do with cards. And just generally leaning into the idea that this is a game made out of cards, what can we do with this? Which ties heavily into card advantage, because card advantage ultimately is another way of thinking, like, this is a game made out of cards, what's the natural consequence of that? Well, having more cards is, right? Let's see. But here we're going to just explore some broader, wacky fun things you can do with cards. Right, so cards are the thing that makes card games special. This may be a surprise to you. And so we can do a lot of things that no other medium could ever possibly do by leaning into this card element of our medium. Right, if we can use cards cleverly, we can minimize the component demand of our game, right? We can, if we can redirect non-card components and make them into card components, now there's less component demand, both digitally and physically to worry about.
Vanguard does that well.
Mm-hmm.
It's your life and a resource, and haystack it.
We're going to talk about that, yes.
Oh, okay.
That is exactly where I'm going with this, yes. Right, it allows you, if you can think about clever ways to move cards between piles, you can create some mechanics, and we have some examples of mechanics that are actually very complicated and have a lot going on, but because the way that all these conceptions are actually materialized, it just comes down to moving a card across the table, you can represent this very complex action that actually has a lot of weird implications and a lot of weird nuance
In a simple
a
way.
very simple way that players can track because it's all just moving a card. And that's just all around how do you stack cards in clever ways. Yes.
Is there ever a way to do that in a too complicated a way where it's a simple physical action or a simple representation on a board state, but the action itself is too complicated to think about for most people? Because I know humans are pattern matching machines, but if a pattern is too complicated, we see it as noise and just like it's not worth analyzing. That might be a tangential to this.
I mean, I'm not 100% sure what I'm asking, but I think I understand. From what I understand you're asking, and tell me if I'm not answering your question, I don't think that's really a worry because of the concept of lenticularity, right? From the beginner lens, right? From the non-comprehending lens, that's where we really worry about complexity showing up, is in the lens of the lens of the beginner doesn't understand complexity, doesn't want the complexity player. And from their lens, they just fail to observe all that level of extra complexity in the actual game action. They just see a card move across the table, and they know how to see a pile of cards and know the game state. So they just, all the extra complexity is out of their lens, and we don't need to worry about that. What's in their lens is just a card moving, and that's the thing they can understand. And then more and more of that complexity becomes apparent as we get into more and more advanced lenses, which is kind of actually how we want complexity to work.
Okay. I didn't have an example in mind, and I think this needs an example to actually articulate well, but that makes sense almost no matter what you do. If the action is simple, you can grok it as well. It's just the action, right? So yeah, I think that's good.
Yep. Right. Generally speaking, just reusing this core element of our game in a bunch of different ways tends to want to create mechanics that are very systemic, because they're all coming back into this core system of cards are in piles. Tends to make things that are very elegant because we're just reusing the same mechanics over and over again, and because all mechanics are touching base on the same central mechanic, they all interplay with each other, right? So that creates a lot of elegance, and it creates a lot of interesting dynamics because things just keep running into each other and making dynamics all over the place, which, as we talked about earlier, that's how we want a systemic game to work. A systemic, elegant game to work. We want things that are just going to run into each other and make dynamics for us. And tying everything into cards tends to want to do that. And then we can use this to emphasize or de-emphasize card advantage because, you know, we're moving cards around all over the place. You could use that pretty elegantly to toy with card advantage because card advantage is all about mirror cards. Any questions about these basic conceptions of the kinds of advantages we get out of just playing with cards and using cards for extra things? I'm also going to spend the rest of this workshop talking about examples of all this stuff, so. Cool.
Well, I can ask this as it becomes relevant.
Okay. So I've actually structured this workshop in terms of time periods and companies that were prominent in those time periods, because, you know, this is when we see different trends in other things to do with cards pop up, right? The way games treat cards kind of tends to evolve over time and evolve between different theaters of card games. So we're going to talk about that. So first we're going to talk about a little company called Decipher, and that was very active in the early 2000s, and a lot of other games that were coming out around the same time, they were very active in the early 2000s. Okay, so one of the things Decipher became very famous for, this kind of became a trademark of all their games, was the idea of destiny numbers. Destiny numbers are a way to get around the idea of, well, I have this mechanic that I want to roll dice for, right? It's Wars, or Star Wars, they're the same game. I want to do a space battle at this planet. I want that space battle to be semi-random. I want to roll a die. I don't want to have my players bring a die to the table. The answer to that question is destiny numbers, right? The idea of destiny number is every card has a number on it, like this, in the upper right-hand corner. And if you ever would roll a die, you just take the top card of your deck and you discard it. And its destiny number is the die number that you just rolled. Right? It works a lot like a die because you're just randomly generating a number.
Did they make deck building games? Like with deck building as a primary feature?
Does Destiny? Or just Decipher?
Yeah, because then couldn't that lead to the idea of, well, I have a rigged deck that only has 4, 5s, and 6s. But as you say there later in the slide, the idea is that a well-constructed deck has a nice distribution of those numbers.
Yeah.
Is that something players have to
Just-
optimize for?
I don't think Decipher animated a deck building game as we defined at the beginning. Remember, deck building games are Magic is not a deck building.
I don't
game.
mean deck building games, but deck building has an aspect of making a deck for a CCG.
Yes, in Decipher's games, you do get to make your own decks. Yes, right. The idea generally is that you, how you distribute the numbers across your cards does matter because of that exact concern right there. There are a few different answers to that, right? As mentioned, Warhammer 40k did a thing where they just put all the big numbers on the weak cards, right? So you could, that was an actual strategy, is, hey, here's my giant horde of weenies, also, I always roll crits. Right? And that's just a way to play that game. Or alternatively, here's my giant mech, good luck fighting it, also it's only ever going to roll a 1, but whatever, it's giant. Right? That was an actual strategic conundrum they created because they had the dichotomy of roll better or have better units. Decipher tended to approach this problem in a little more nuanced way, right? But you would still kind of get this breakdown of, well, certain types of cards get high numbers, certain types of cards get low numbers. So, I forget exactly how they did it in Wars, what the breakdown of what kinds of cards got which numbers was, right? But generally speaking, it would come down to well, cool, I make a deck full of 4s and 6s. Well, I have a bunch of pump spells and some really dinky creatures and no powerful creatures and nothing that gets me any resources, right? Something like that.
Something interesting about this number is that it has a low impact on the power of a card, but it definitely has an impact on the power of a card in a deck. So it's something at least I've seen in card game design that I've tried to do or seen of student work is that it's easy to make a lot of numbers that if you change a single thing, it's a drastic change to the entire card. Having small dials to tune that is nice.
Yes. And these are very much a nice small dial. Well, this card's slightly underpowered for its cost. Turn up the destiny number by 1. And that is certainly a thing that gets done. Yeah. Destiny numbers are all...
Sorry, nothing useful. I was just going to say the destiny density. It's probably something that comes up when talking about this game.
Destiny numbers are also cool because because it's not pure random, right? The player does have a certain amount of knowledge and agency over what they're drawing. They know what destiny numbers have come out, so they know what destiny numbers are left in the deck, and then they're able to stack cards a little bit in their deck.
Vanguard's kind of like that, but on a much more simplified level.
Yeah.
It's not counting a sum total of, I'm drawing low, so I'm going to get high soon. It's just 1s or 0s, really.
Yep. And so that allows the players to, it makes it a little less random and gives the players a little more agency, which is good. Makes it a little more strategic because the player can toy with the randomness if they want to. Also, example of way to distribute things. I don't remember how Decipher did it, but another game that used this mechanic, the Free Realms TCG, their dice rolls were on a scale of 1 to 4, and so all your creatures were 1s and 2s almost universally, and all your pump spells and resource spells were 3s and 4s, and you just needed creatures, so you have to play some 1s and 2s.
This might be an example of the thing I was trying to get at earlier, which is have a mechanic that's potentially so complicated the player wouldn't get everything of it immediately. But the entire point of it is you don't have to know all the details, you just roll it out.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the simplest interpretation of it, but it is a valid and usable and actionable interpretation of it.
Right, that right there is the exact principle of particularity. It very much applies here. All right, any other questions about destiny numbers? Probably the best. If you ever think you need to roll a die in a TCG, you probably want to use Destiny Numbers. It's a cool mechanic. Also consider not, because you're already getting randomness from card draw, but cool mechanic, has a good history. Okay. The other big mechanic that Decipher was known for, especially in Wars and Star Wars CCGs, because they're the same game, was the idea that your cards are just your life and your resource. The idea that your deck is your life total and that when you deck out you lose your life was really popular in the early 2000s because people kind of got tired of having that little Magic Gathering notepad of I have 20 cards. Throwing cards out of your deck is just so much easier to keep track of.
So it already ticks down.
Yep. So Decipher leaned into that. A lot of other games that were coming out at the same time that Decipher was active leaned into that. WotC made a few games that worked that way. It kind of went out of vogue. One of the big reasons you hear cited is that it has just this really weird player experience impact where players get to see big powerful cards falling out of their deck from taking damage, and then the psychological effect and the psychological feeling about that damage they took, because they see the loss of that powerful card, is a lot higher than the actual loss of, oh, I took 1 damage. Like, they actually only just took 1 damage from a gameplay strategy perspective. It's not that big a loss, but it feels bigger because they now know they're never going to draw the best card in their deck, which is kind of just this weird psychological effect that you don't necessarily want in your game.
Did you lose from the top of your deck or from the bottom?
Top of your deck.
Though as long as it reveals, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
There's a stronger psychological effect from the top of your deck because you're like, I was so close to, and then it's gone.
Which is not how strategy actually works, but it's how players think strategy works, and it's how they feel.
We're not number crunching robots. Unfortunately, feelings hard to divorce from strategy.
We sadly have to care about feelings in game design. That's a very large percentage of what we're here for. Matter of fact, I think that's 100% of our job.
You make a strong point.
It's not really much point of making a game if you don't have feelings associated with the game, even if.
You can make a tax system.
Also, using your deck as life has weird card advantage problems, as you kind of already mentioned, right? Now you're punishing players for getting too much card advantage. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. It definitely is going to mess with your other systems and
if you're not aware of it, will
turn tables and do weird things that you weren't expecting it to do. Maybe those are good weird things. Maybe those are bad weird things.
But they should be considered when you make the choice.
If you're going to use your deck size as life total, it throws weird wrenches, and both in player psychology and just at your other mechanics, which is why it's kind of gone out of vogue. Because it was very big vogue for a little while. You can also just use cards as resource. This is a thing that Bushiroad still does, but Decipher has been doing this for a lot longer, where you don't have like little tokens of like, here are my money tokens. You just have a pile of cards. It's like, here are my money cards. I need to pay top two cards in my money pile, throw them in the discard. It works. It does its job. That mechanic's still around pretty consistently. It's just a cheap way to get tokens, right? It's just using cards. You can do interesting things with relationships between resources and card draw. For example, in Wars, the cost to drawing 1 card was always 1 resource. Literally, you just drew cards out of your resource pile. You want to pay 1 resource to draw a card, just pick a card out of the resource pile, and you
1-to-1.
Yep.
Thus
right, that's an example of one of these really interesting. That's an actually slightly complicated mechanic. Oh, I have to pay resources to draw cards, but that complexity is completely gone because.
What do you mean? I just drew a card.
I just pick up a card. It's one simple action.
Wait a minute, does that mean you could just pick up your entire resource thing?
Yes, you
But there was also your life.
No, your deck is your life, your resource pile isn't separate.
Okay.
You could just pick up your entire resource pile and put it in your hand if you wanted to.
Not be able to pay anything.
But then you have a bunch of cards and nothing with which to pay for those cards. Yeah.
And would your deck cards go to your resource pile instead of going to your hand?
Yes, correct. You never drew cards off your deck. You only ever drew cards off your resource pile.
Okay. And would the resource pile be flipped above or flipped down?
The resource pile is, it's right here, right?
Okay.
Here's the diagram. Here's your deck. here's your resource pile. Cards from your deck go onto your top of your resource pile. Cards from your resource pile go into your hand. Or you have this paid pile over here called the used pile. If you want to pay something, you just take the top card of your used pile and move it over there.
What was I gonna ask? What would you be able to see what you were paying with?
No.
No.
You had to choose, yeah, you couldn't see.
So it would be like, do I draw 3 cards, hope I get what I want, and
Yeah.
then pay.
Yeah, exactly. Alright, any other questions about these basic ideas of things we could do using cards as resources, life totals, what have you? No? Okay, cool. So now we're going to move on to Bushiroad and other modern Japanese card games. For some reason, modern American card games still like to use lots of dice and counters and health track paths and what have you. Modern Japanese card games are very into, you need a deck of cards and that's it. Let's see what we can do with your one deck of cards. And they come up with some really cool stuff, so we're going to talk about it. And I think the most prominent company for coming up with cool things to do with cards is Bushiroad, which is why they're the company that's getting the honor of being name dropped here. But that's not to say that Takia Atami and other Japanese card game companies aren't doing cool stuff. And don't deserve credit for it. First we're going to talk about Duel Masters, which isn't even a Bushiroad game. It's a WotC game. But it's Japanese and it came up with a lot of mechanics. So we're going to talk about it. A lot of mechanics we just talked about. Whatever. Right? So this gives us a different interpretation of cards as life total. Where now your deck isn't your life total, and you deal out a separate life pile of 5 cards in Duel Masters, these were called your 5 shields. That's your life total. So that kind of removes the weird conceptions, the weirdness from the deck as life total, right? It's because it's its own separate pile, it's just messing with things less, right? It's less likely to throw wrenches at things because it's more
If
isolated.
it's in
from
the
things.
life pile, it's in the life pile.
Yeah.
And unless you have a special ability to get it out of there, which hurts your life pile,
Yeah.
it doesn't really affect you anymore.
Also, this game actually does the exact opposite of the old, deck as life total psychological effect of, oh no, I just discarded my best card because I took 1 damage. This game, all the cards you discard out of your life pile go into your hand. So it's, oh yay, I took 1 damage and got to draw the best card of my deck. It totally flips the script on that psychological effect. Which is also a really nice rubber banding mechanic because now the more damage you take, the more
I like
card advantage you
Vanguard
get
for
as a
that.
catch-up.
Vanguard has strong implementation of that.
Yep, Vanguard has an implementation of this. This mechanic is so good at what it does that Elder Scrolls Legends is a digital card game, so they have far less motivation to use cards to track things. They can just add trackers at no component cost.
And
They
do
still
it.
implement. They don't even have. It's not even your life pool anymore. You have 30 life, but you just also separately have 5 cards you get to draw as you take damage because they just wanted that.
Well, even if it's easy from a technological point of view to just throw on a tracker and a computer's handling it.
Yeah.
If it's a separate resource, a player has to think about it separately. So
Yes.
maybe there is value to keeping it all as cards, quote
Yeah.
unquote, even though it's
It
that resource
certainly-
is a card.
It certainly keeps things simpler. But yeah, so that's a cool thing that Duel Masters did. Duel Masters was also an early discard-based resource system, which I'm not going to talk about because we already talked about those, unless people completely forgot and want me to go over discard-based resource systems again.
I think I remember that.
Yeah. So yeah, this was a game that came out like the late 90s, so this is one of the first games that are really doing these things that we're going to see a lot of repercussions with going into modern games. Also, Duel Masters is really simple and does some cool stuff. I almost made this entire workshop series about Duel Masters because I'm like, what do I need to talk about? Well, I need to talk about that. Duel Masters is a really simple example of that. Well, I need to talk about that. Oh, Duel Masters is a really simple example of that. Duel Masters is cool. Also, decks are like $5 because it's stopped translating it. English language decks are $5 because they stopped translating it to English.
Why does that
Why wouldn't
make
that
it cheaper?
increase the price? Not.
Because the English language decks got their own card back, and that they're not legal in any other scene of the game.
So we just have bootleg decks now.
Basically, yes.
Wild.
And they're like $5 on Amazon. So if you want a game to study. But anyways, any questions about Duel Masters and card and the shield mechanic? Cool. So now let's talk about more recent implementations of these kinds of mechanics. Bushiroad, as mentioned, has got a lot of interesting stuff with this, right? Which just kind of is playing to the idea of if we have a pile of cards, or we have a way to easily make a pile of cards, that's a resource that our game gets at very little cost. Right? In Vanguard, you have two resources, your Counterblast and your Soul Blast, that you just kind of naturally accrue, right? You have your Vanguard, and you're constantly playing new cards on top of your old Vanguard to replace it, and so all those old Vanguards just kind of stack up as just a pile of cards, and all the time it's like, hey, that's a resource. That's actually kind of complicated. You gain one of this resource every time you get a new Vanguard. That's not a trivial mechanic, but it's trivially implemented because you're just leaving cards there.
It's strictly simpler to place a card down and not remove everything underneath it.
Exactly, and now you have this mechanic where every time you get a new Vanguard, you get a new Soul resource.
Oh no! Is it team I want you to talk to later? Not in this talk.
Okay. They also do the thing, they do the shields as health mechanic, but it goes the other way. Instead of just drawing cards out of your health pile, you put cards into your damage pile, and when your damage pile fills up, you're dead. That's a resource, right? You're not paying cards out of that, but you're taking the cards that are face up and turning them face down to pay a resource, which is very trivially implemented because, like, again, oh, I get this resource every time I take damage is not the simplest mechanic, but hey, I have a card, I just put a card there, and then, oh, hey, I can turn that face card down is trivial, right?
I've only played Vanguard one time, but I was surprised on, like, it's got a lot of stuff going on. You've got like 4 different resources or whatever,
Mhm.
but they weren't that complicated to figure out what was going on. And
Yep.
That makes sense.
Yep. Vice Wars does some interesting stuff with its clock mechanic, which is both your XP and your health. Right? You get to do, like, for example, Vice Wars has a mechanic. You can discard a card and take 1 damage and draw 2 cards. That's kind of a complicated mechanic. But it's really trivial because what it actually means is I take 1 card in my hand and I just push it in my damage zone. And I've now paid 1, discarded a card and paid 1 health. Right? That's just really elegantly implemented. There's also, because you have these cards here, you're allowed to play with the idea of, hey, I can look at, say, the colors of the cards in my XP bar and use that. And they do use that. The color of your cards in your XP bar actually matters for other mechanics, and you don't need to worry about it. It's just a quality you get inadvertently because you're using cards, and cards have these qualities, and you're just looking back at these qualities that are already there. Right? You don't need to introduce the conception of colored damage. You just, your cards are colored and your damage is card, so you have colored damage. And that's a thing they get to use.
So you don't have to have not only a bunch of little tags to track damage, but also a bunch of little tags that track what color of damage. You now just have your card.
Exactly.
That's cool.
I can talk more about these in detail, but I think you're almost better now just looking at these games yourselves if these mechanics interest you. Any questions about these kinds of basic conceptions and like how they're trying to do things and what these kinds of advantages these mechanics are giving? Specific consequences of any of these mechanics or motivations of any of these mechanics? Okay. Burst mechanics are another cool thing that you get to do when you're using cards as resources, and particularly cards as life. I don't actually know what did these first, but they're very popular in Japan. They're in Duel Masters. They're in Final Fantasy TCG. They're in all the Bushiroad games.
Oh, it's on event.
Yeah, right. On event, when a card moves from point A to point B, do a thing, right? And because normally it's like when this event happens, have this special ability trigger is kind of complicated and weird to enter. Where are these special abilities coming from? how are they generated, what determines when they're happening. Oh, I have to remember to, because this event happened, also go check this thing. But when that event is being implemented and just moving cards around,
Is it printed on the cards itself, or is it just like a nature of the game every time you move a thing?
these abilities are always printed on the cards.
Okay, that would make more sense.
Put that as an inherent mechanic, right? Because you're just moving this card, you can just see this giant icon being like, hey, do this thing on this card, and then it's trivial to just do the thing because you're moving the card and looking at it, right? The most common version of this is you use just catch a mechanic a lot, where get special effect from card when discard card or move card as a result of damage, right? Right, in Final Fantasy, whenever you take a damage card, if that damage card has an EX effect, you get to use the EX effect. In Vanguard, whenever you take a damage, if that damage has a trigger on it, you get to activate that trigger effect. Yes.
You could easily do the inverse and get, hey, this is a really strong card to use effect, but I don't want to use it because it hurts me. I think there's a Keyforge card that doesn't exist yet, where it's a Mars card in the new set, where it's just a really big unit, it hits hard, but every time you do it, you gain a chain.
Yeah, right.
On fight.
Good effect. You know, like, oh, hey, I could play this card to my resource zone to gain a free resource, but when I do that, it does this negative effect to me because it's got the on make resource penalty effect.
And you don't have to think about, oh wait, no, this X happened, I have to go look up the rulebook. Oh yeah, this is what it is.
Yeah.
Just on the card.
Yep.
It's simpler to just read than to remember.
There's this weird card in Eternal that when you discard it, it plays, and it plays like 2 Justice Sigils or something like that. And it's like play 2 Justice Sigils, and then underneath it says, when you discard this card, play it.
Yeah.
I was like, oh.
We're talking about that exact mechanic, right? So that's a popular thing that you can do really cool stuff with. Lots of games play with it. The simplest version, right, is just like in whatchamacallit, Wheatcross, right? You have a health pile, you deal damage. Normally when you take damage, you take the card out of your health pile and put it in your resource pile. Which is another cool thing you can do with using cards as stuff. But some cards have a special symbol on them that says when you would put this, right, when you take this card as damage, if you would normally put it in your resource pile, you may choose to put it in your resource pile or your hand. It's implemented, it's really easy to do that just because it's got that. That's actually a kind of complicated mechanic, right? Every time you take a damage, you gain a resource, except sometimes randomly, you get to choose to gain a resource or draw a card. Except it's implemented really trivially because they're just reusing cards for everything. You and a hand.
Yeah. I've only seen relatively modern games, so it's kind of hard to imagine the alternative to having it printed on event effects on cards.
Yes.
What was it like before this became popular? Or what are some instances
You
of
didn't
not
have
relying
these
on this?
So, in older card games, you had a lot more rules in the rulebook that weren't printed on cards, right? Because this medium kind of spun off of role-playing games with kind of the parent medium.
They had centralized
And
rule books for everything.
And so there's this rulebook-centric mentality of, you know, this card just says it's a thrall. What does it mean to be a thrall? Go look up the rules for thralls. And you have like 40 different special words that work like that.
So it's
Thank
the same
you,
thing.
Vampire. Thank you, Rage.
So it's close to the same thing, just printed on the card, and therefore doesn't have to be for everything of this type. It's just for this card.
Yeah.
So it's a finer grained control, and it's more intuitive.
Yeah.
All it costs you is real estate on your card,
Yep.
which is notably high price, but that seems pretty useful.
Yes.
That's
This is cool.
That's one thing I like about Eternal is you can have a fairly low real estate used on your card, but when you actually look at the card, it pops up a bunch of like side bubbles that aren't on the card. Like,
Oh, this is a digital game?
yeah, it's like, oh, this is what Reckless does. Oh, this is what Berserk does.
It's a very powerful advantage of using keyword abilities in digital games that a lot of them have really good advantage of.
I mean, keywords in general is a concept to cut down on the complexity and size of descriptions.
But you have to remember that keywords cut down complexity for franchise players, but not for experienced players. They actually raise the complexity for inexperienced players because now they need to learn the keyword and the effect.
That's true.
So you can have these nice cards with like 3 specific paragraph long abilities, and then their own paragraph of actual, this is specific to this card ability, which is nice.
Any questions about burst mechanics?
Why are they called burst?
It's just a word that comes up a lot. They get called burst something or other often. I think the idea is just like, oh, hey, this thing happened. Now this effect is bursting out or something like that.
I guess on event is
Also, would this be like a trap card, for example?
No.
Because
These very explicitly deal with this card is moving from point A to point B. Because this card is moving, this card's effect is going off.
Oh, so when you're moving a card from one part of the field to another?
Usually, this means you have a health pool. The
Uh-huh.
common example of this that you see more often than anything else, I have a health pool of cards.
Uh-huh.
Move card out of health pool, effect goes off.
Oh, so this effectively works when your cards are being used as your health.
Correct. This
Okay.
only works if you're using cards as things other than cards, and you're moving them around as a result of game actions.
So here's an interesting thing. Like in a lot of games, even if your cards aren't technically your life source, if you deck out, you still lose.
Correct.
So does that mean that your cards are like your sort of secondary life force that's like unsaid, or?
Technically speaking, yes. I would be cautious to emphasize that, because in most games that implement that mechanic, that isn't actually a meaningful mechanic that doesn't come up in most games. That's really there as an extra rule to catch edge cases, if that makes sense, as opposed to a pure mechanic of the game, right? Like, when was the last time you decked out Magic the Gathering?
I've never played Magic. I've only ever played Yu-Gi-Oh.
Surprisingly frequently in Eternal. Like, it's not very often. It's always because they have a bunch of cards that just toss, right? They have a specific deck
but
designed
that's
to
middle,
make.
right?
Yeah.
That's a very specific, yeah.
But otherwise, no, never.
Exactly.
I see.
It's kind of like if you're evenly matched, the guy who is having to do more to stay evenly matched, he loses.
Yeah. Eventually.
Eventually, if you stay evenly matched.
Yeah.
It's just to
end the game.
to end the game at some point. Yeah.
To make sure the game can't literally go on forever is the most common motivation for implementing the mechanic. So you can lean into it, right? It does enable like mill decks, which is an interesting strategic concept of, hey, I still have to attack I'll still have to attack a life source, but I'm attacking a different life source. So I kind of play off the medium a little bit, which is an interesting spot that we can talk about, but it's pretty niche, so and pretty understandable through the lens of all this other stuff we're talking about. So I wasn't going to talk about it now. Any other questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings? Cool. Now we're moving on to Play Fusion and the future. Maybe, I don't actually know what's happening in the future, but Play Fusion is happening right now and their mechanics haven't caught on, so maybe they'll catch on in the future. So Play Fusion is a little company that does something very interesting with their cards that I want to talk about because it's cool. Their cards they have cards that are inherently broken into stages, right? Up to 4 separate effects happen on one card. And the way they make you keep track of that is each effect goes on a corner of the card, and then you play the card face up, and you do its left corner effect, and the next corner you rotate it and do its right corner effect, and after that you rotate it and get the third effect, and after that you rotate it and get the fourth effect. And that's just a very interesting way to just cram 4 effects broken up over the course of 4 turns onto one little card that's very trivial to keep track of, right? You don't need to put beads on it, you don't need to do a slider, you don't need to remember, oh, this happens, then this happens, this happens, you just spin your card. So that's just a cool little way of keep thinking about it. Not even just like, hey, this is a card, this is a slide of paper, but hey, this is a card, this is a slide of paper with 4 corners that we can spin. And using that to their advantage to implement some mechanics that a lot of other games could never implement, because keeping track of 4 separate effects on one card in a sequential order is kind of challenging. That's a lot of tracking normally, except
For more than one card, that starts getting painful.
unless you're doing the Play Fusion spin thing. And they do other stuff with this, right? Like they have, you can use this as a life total tracker. You can use this as, they use this to track quests, right? Where I have to do these 4 things in order. Do first thing, do second thing, do third thing, do fourth thing, rotate, rotate, rotate. Right? You can track a lot of stuff just by spinning your cards and using the fact that they have 4 different sides. And that's a really big thing that PlayFusion does on all their games. All 2 of their games.
Is this an example card?
Huh?
It's an example card with 4 effects.
Correct.
How do you know
That's
what
a-
the effects are?
That's a tiny amount of text.
Yeah,
Is
the
it
tiny
like,
amount of text says rotation. What does it actually say? Let me go over there.
is there a symbol representing the current state?
That says rotation damage to your opponent, yeah.
Okay, so it's 1 damage,
it's got-
2 damage, 3 damage, 4 damage.
Exactly. Right, they have the rotations. They've introduced the rotation symbol, which simply means look at the number in the upper left-hand corner and
So as long as they describe effects in terms of that variable, they don't have to have 4 different cases. They just have,
correct.
here's the effective formula for
Yep.
whatever state you're in, do that.
They also have syntax for if they want to do different cases.
Would they print that sideways to align with the number, or would they
No.
print that as case 1, case 2, and then a list?
They do the list.
Okay. This is, again,
Though
tangent.
shift uses another game that uses spinning, and shift uses aligns to the sides of the card.
Okay.
So
I feel like that'd be more elegant. If you needed symbols specifically to be like, oh, you have this resource, but only in this stage, you would just slap it up there aligned with the
yeah,
number, in this case.
yeah.
But this is like vaguely related to designing algorithms. If you want to make it run faster, you generally just throw more memory at it. In this case, more memory is more, you have 4 states on 1 card.
Yep.
You don't have to, yeah.
Yep.
You take that burden away from the player, but it's written there somewhere.
Yep. Which is very elegant. And just a cool thing you can do with your pieces of paper. And that's what we're talking about.
Pieces of paper.
Yes. It.
Are they often rectangles? Why?
Huh?
Could you make an octagonal deck for 8
Can you
states?
have a circular deck of cards?
Hecatome had, how many heads were on a Hecatome card? I think Hecatome cards were 6-sided?
Why would it be hexatone?
I think it's 7-sided.
Anyway,
I think they were 7s, or 5-sided.
there are
No, they were
affordances even in this.
5-sided. Hecatome cards were 5-sided.
That's neat.
Yeah.
There are affordances even in this that I would say most people are familiar with Magic, so Magic format tends to shine through in a lot of games just because that's what people are familiar with.
Also, there's a lot of accessories for cards out there that a lot of
Oh,
enfranchised
yeah.
card games players really like, and it helps that those accessories you only need to buy for 3 different sizes of cards because there are only 3 different standardized card sizes.
Yeah, and you don't want to be like, well, how do I get card backs for my pentagonal cards?
Exactly.
Okay, that's probably a stronger reason.
How do I get a box for my pentagonal cards?
Right? Like, there's this whole
It's
industry
simple.
that's just
Give
like
up.
card game accessories that are all built around these couple standardized sizes, and that's nice because you can get all kinds of cool accessories for all kinds of games. Yes.
So taking this number idea and taking the idea of messing with what a rectangular card is,
Mhm.
I propose a terrible idea, which is cards, but there's like a hole punched out of the middle of them, and the game, you have like a flat plastic plate with a stick up, and you have spinners on every card.
At that point, I don't even know if you're making a card game or if you're just like making what should we call it? Pokemon Duel.
Oh,
Pokemon
shit.
Miniatures game. Where you don't collect cards, you collect spinners.
Oh yeah, well, that's
Beyblade?
weird.
It's actually a pretty decent game. It's not a card game, but it is.
The material cost is high because
The
they're
material cost
physical
is high.
like miniatures for everything.
Also, it turns out that unlike cards or dice, spinners are super easy to manipulate if you have high enough dexterity in a tournament setting.
Oh. Okay.
Ouch.
Yes.
This
They
one-
brought back this game digitally.
Ah. In order to have the fair spin, they have one judge come by with a Dremel, and they just kind of give it an initial.
Anyways, that is the end of my 2 workshops that I had for today. So, any questions, comments, concerns about weird, cool consequences of the fact that your game is made out of cards at all? Cool. If not, I'm gonna go get lunch.
Are you telling that to the stream? Yo, stream, join us for lunch.
Yep. Yeah. Just hunt us down and find us for lunch.
I would totally join you if I could eat.
Oh, if?
Oh, I'm fasting.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Makes
It's
sense.
not like a warlock thing.